I have learned to trust the sounds of my office, the low breath of the heating vent, the faint hiss where the window seal never quite took, the distant elevator that always sighs before it opens. After 15 years of psychiatry, routine is the scaffolding that keeps the day upright. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Warren. I practice on the 4th floor of a brick building in Back Bay, where late sun gets tangled in the brownstone cornices and leaves a copper residue on the windows. On that particular November morning, the light came in thin and cold, and every sound felt calibrated a half step off, as if the room were tuning itself to a frequency I hadn't heard before. I set my mug on its ring of heat and rewrote a treatment plan I already agreed with, just to keep my hands moving. The framed licenses on the wall reflected the window in miniature, small, bright rectangles nested inside my name. I adjusted a picture of the harbor, smoothed the throw on the couch, straightened the legal pad on the table. My work is made of these small preparations. Set the stage, open the door, meet the person who steps through. Calm is contagious. When I breathe evenly, patients learn to borrow that rhythm. The appointment book blinked a new name in pale blue, a referral from an ER physician I trust, urgent but not emergent, a first session scheduled for 9. No history attached, just a short note. Arrived alone, cooperative, requested a female psychiatrist, sleeps poorly. I looked at the clock on the bookcase and watched the second hand make its tidy climb toward the hour. It is an old clock, brass rim, nicked at 2 points, dependable in a way most machines aren't anymore. Its tick usually tucks itself into the background. That morning it stood forward, clean and loud, like the office had emptied to make room for it. Outside, a streetcar scraped past, the sound a thin blade. I listened for steps in the corridor and heard only the HVAC and my own pen tapping the pad. I told myself the first meeting is always a study in restraint. Observe before naming, anchor before interpreting. The air tasted metallic, the way it does in the hours before snow. I checked the door to be sure it would not catch, because sometimes old wood sticks at the hinge when the weather turns. At 8:58, the motion sensor in the hall clicked. The shadow under my door hesitated, then vanished. I stood, then sat again, deciding not to greet anyone in the corridor. Inside the room, the rules are mine. I smoothed my skirt, aligned the pen with the margin line, and laid my hand flat on the cool desk. The brass lamp made a small circle of warmth that barely touched the edges of the room. When the handle moved, it did so without the little stutter most visitors cause. The door opened quietly. No apology of hinges, no misstep against the rug. Cold air braided itself into the room and made the tiny flame of the lamp look fragile. For a heartbeat, I saw only a silhouette, a narrow figure backlit by the dim hallway, head tilted, posture controlled almost to the point of tension. I felt my chest answer with a tightness I couldn't name. "Good morning," I said, because the first sentence is a key in a lock. My voice sounded as if it belonged to someone else, a little too careful, a fraction too soft. The figure did not respond. She stepped in, letting the door fall shut behind her with a sound more deliberate than heavy. The room, which had always been manageable in its quiet, became suddenly vast, an auditorium with no audience, only the pressure of being watched by the walls. I have worked with grief that corrodes, with rage that floods rooms, with despair that clings to clothing. This felt different, like standing at the mouth of a tunnel and hearing a train that has not yet turned the corner. I nodded toward the chair, the same one where countless doubts have sat and worked themselves into ordinary language. She took the seat. The lamp's circle caught the edge of her jaw and the pale line of her throat, then slipped away. I positioned my pen over the first blank line and waited for the familiar exchange to begin. It didn't. The silence held, not empty, not stubborn, but purposeful, as if something were being arranged just outside the field of my attention. The clock ticked once, then once more, and the room, my room, leaned imperceptibly toward her. I asked for her name, even though it was already on my schedule, because the ritual matters. Names anchor people to the room. "Claire," she said, and the syllable felt pared to the bone, as if any extra sound would have been wasteful. She sat very still, hands folded in her lap, thumbs touching like two quiet metronomes. I noticed the faint crescent dents along her cuticles, the pallor that seems to come from somewhere deeper than skin. When I offered water, she shook her head. When I set the glass down anyway, Her eyes tracked the condensation bead its way into a thin, trembling ring. I began with the soft questions, the ones that allow a person to choose their doorway. Sleep, appetite, work, the last time hope felt reachable. Her answers were clipped, not hostile, but edited. Sleep came in pieces. Food was a chore. Work was paused. She lived alone in an apartment near the river. Top floor, too much sky, she said, and looked toward the lamp as if it had spoken out of turn. I made a note about metaphors of exposure, the clinical shorthand I used to keep my thoughts orderly. Beneath the notation, I wrote a smaller line I rarely write on a first session. The room feels altered. I asked about the ER visit that prompted the referral. She lifted one shoulder in a non-committal arc. Headaches, she said, blacking out. Then, after a beat, noise. The word hung between us. What kind of noise? I asked. Claire's gaze slid past me to the window, then returned so abruptly I felt the movement in my throat. Wet, she said, like someone trying to breathe through cloth. The radiator sighed, perfectly on cue, and for a moment I tasted the metallic air again. It is part of my work to tolerate silence without rushing to rescue it. I let the quiet stand, counted 4 breaths, and asked what she hoped might change here. Claire's eyes met mine, and the impression was not of contact, but of pressure, as if the line from her gaze to my face were a weight. In 15 years, I have known grief-dark eyes, manic bright eyes, pupils narrowed to pinheads by fear. Hers were different, dark in a way that felt depthless, a color you could not cross. It was not theatrical. It was ruinously calm. I felt the small muscles along my spine tighten as if I had leaned over a railing and found no city below. She spoke then, evenly. It watches when I blink, she said. It does not like the light. It stands where the light won't go. I asked who it was, careful with pronouns, careful with belief. Claire blinked once, slow, like lowering a veil. I thought it was grief, she said. Then a habit, then a trick of the apartment. It followed me here. She didn't look around the room. She didn't need to. The statement reorganized the space as effectively as moving furniture. I tracked her breathing, steady, shallow, and my own, suddenly too audible. I asked about duration, onset, progression. She told me the headaches began in late summer, the blackouts in October, the noise last week. It learned me, she said, and the grammar wrongness of it scraped something inside me. When I inquired about harm, self or otherwise, her mouth thinned. Not yet, she said, but it practices. I wrote the words exactly because certain sentences should not be improved. I suggested a sleep study, gentle stabilization, and SSRI as a bridge while we worked. She nodded without interest, like I had proposed rearranging a chair in a burning room. When I asked about family, her hands tightened, then released. They don't see it, she said, or they do and pretend they don't. The clock ticked in its steady brass circle. I had the sensation of standing at the shallow end of a pool while the floor sloped away faster than expected. At the end of the hour, I offered a second appointment. Claire rose in a single practiced motion. I'll come, she said, and turned toward the door. Halfway there, she stopped, tilted her head like she was listening to a whisper I couldn't catch, and looked back at me. The room leaned again, subtly, as if the air had been taught a new trick. Don't leave the light off when you write, she said. It stands better in the dark. Then she was gone, and the quiet she left behind felt used, as if something had pressed its shape into it and would return to find the impression still warm. After she left, the office did not return to itself. The lamp's circle looked too sharp at the edges, like a cutout laid over a deeper black. I closed the door and stood for a moment with my palm on the wood, as if I could slow the air on the other side. Routine is repair, so I turned to the screen and opened the chart. The ER referral was skeletal. Headaches, brief losses of awareness, sleep disruption, no substances, no immediate risk. Follow-up psychiatry recommended. There was a link to prior records that I hadn't seen. An inpatient stay 2 years earlier at a small hospital on the North Shore. I clicked through. The scan quality was poor, the ink flaring where the pen pressed too hard. The attending's handwriting was brisk, almost cheerful. Then, near discharge, a nursing addendum in a different hand. PT reports persistent perception of presence in room, avoids corners, states it stands where the light won't go, maintains fixed gaze when describing, Requests, lamp remain on. I felt the familiar tug to pathologize promptly and resisted it. Differential first, stories later. Still, the language slid under my ribs. I printed the summary and laid it beside my legal pad. The paper smelled faintly of toner and heat, a sterile shadow of something burned. I wrote a note to call the inpatient psychiatrist listed, Naomi Keller, MD, and dialed before I could think better of it. Her voicemail answered in a flat hospital cadence. I left my name, my number, the date. I did not mention the way Claire's single syllable had felt, paired to the spindle of itself. At the reception desk, Rita leaned past her monitor and asked if everything was all right. New patient, I said. Complicated sleep. She nodded with the sympathetic neutrality of someone who has seen too many versions of every story. In the corridor, the motion sensor hummed awake and the lights came up a fraction too slowly. For a second, the frosted side light beside my door held a shadow that didn't match my shape. When I looked again, it was only the vague geometry of the coat tree. I walked home along Commonwealth, where the trees had already surrendered their leaves, the branches traced in dull wire against a gunmetal sky. In the apartment, the radiator ticked like a metronome found at the bottom of a drawer. I set the printouts on the kitchen table, made tea, and read again the line about corners. The phrase was too confident, as if the patient hadn't learned it, but remembered it. I thought of Claire's thumbs touching, the careful fold of her hands, the pressure of her gaze that felt like weight rather than looking. I am paid to hold belief and disbelief in the same fist and keep both from leaking. An email arrived from a hospital account. Dr. Keller, a single sentence. I preferred to see Ms. Whitmore in the morning. No explanation, no pleasantry. I typed a reply asking for a brief call, a case consult, anything, and watched the cursor blink until the screen dimmed itself a notch, the apartment deciding I had had enough illumination. I kept the lamp on when I wrote my notes because I had been told to. The habit felt superstitious and therefore necessary. I wrote carefully. Language suggests organized perception of threat. Consider trauma spectrum. Rule out seizure activity. Monitor sleep architecture. Note phenomenology of gaze. Above the clinical lines, I wrote something I rarely admit to the page. Room altered. The words looked foolish until I slid them under the rest, where they became only another layer. Near midnight, I stood in the doorway between the hall and the living room and looked at the corners, simple right angles made sinister by the hour. The radiator breathed. The window showed me my own reflection, faint and doubled, the city lights behind it like tiny, indifferent eyes. I told myself that terror is an artifact of unassigned meaning, that the mind hates a blank space and will populate it with whatever shape is closest to hand. The kettle clicked as it cooled. In the quiet that followed, there was a softness, a dampness, as if someone on the other side of thin cloth had just drawn a breath. I did not turn the lamp off. Claire arrived early for the second session, the kind of early that suggests not eagerness, but relief, like a swimmer finding the edge of the pool. The hallway light clicked alive a beat before my door moved, and the cold entered first, thin and chemical, a hospital memory. She sat without prompting in the same chair, aligning herself with the lamp's edge so that one half of her face warmed and the other refused to participate. I offered water again. She nodded this time, but didn't touch the glass. Her eyes settled not on me, but on the space just over my right shoulder, where the wall meets the bookcase in a seam of ordinary shadow. "How was the week?" I asked. Her mouth made the shape of an answer and then chose not to deliver it. I gave her the framework: sleep, appetite, headaches, and she set each word down like a stone. Short for sleep, forgettable for food, not mine for the pain. When I asked what that meant, she tapped her temple once, then shook her head. "Like someone left a window open inside," she said. "It blows through. I can't shut it." I suggested we anchor to the room. 5 things she could see, 4 she could touch. She named the brass lamp, the crooked second license, the hairline crack in the ceiling that migrates over years like a constellation. When I asked her to choose something to touch, she hesitated, then pressed her fingertips into the arm of the chair until the fabric dented. 3 things you can hear, I said. Claire tilted her head. "Your clock," she said. "The vent." Her gaze broke briefly toward the carpet. "And the wet sound," she added. I heard nothing new, only the faithful machinery of a weekday morning, but the word lodged again, damp and patient. "Where is it now?" I asked, keeping my voice as plain as a hallway. Claire's eyes met mine, and the pressure of it was immediate, a two-handed weight against my face. "It likes the seam," she said, glancing past me. "It won't cross the light, but the seam is enough." I angled the lamp a fraction so the edge of the circle slid over the bookcase. The shadow recoiled, obedient to geometry, and yet the room felt as if something had been granted rather than denied. The clock ticked deliberately toward the quarter hour. I watched the second hand climb, and, for a breath, not move. Then it resumed with a neat, apologetic step. Claire blinked slowly, as if mimicking it. "Do you lose time here?" I asked. "Not lose," she said. "It holds it, like a hand around a throat. The air gets thin, and you count anyway." She pressed her tongue to the notch where a canine should have been sharper. 9:17, she said without looking. When I checked, the clock agreed, and the agreement unsettled me more than an error would have. I asked about dreams. "None I remember," she said. "But something sets the room again when I wake. The corners are closer. My window looks like a mouth." Her hand stayed composed, but a tremor visited the tendons at her wrist. I suggested a sleep study. She made a small, careful smile that did not ask permission. "Hospitals have too many corners," she said, "and lights that pretend to help." When I shifted in my chair, the floor gave a soft complaint and the lamp's circle fluttered. The seam behind me seemed momentarily to deepen, a trick of contrast. Claire's gaze sharpened. "Don't turn around," she said, not urgently, simply as if describing weather. I didn't. The part of my back that faced the bookcase felt newly furnished with nerves. I adjusted my breathing to something generous and slow and invited her to borrow it. She did, for 3 cycles, and the room expanded just enough to let me think. At the hour's end, I stood to walk her to the door. She remained seated, eyes fixed on the place where the light failed. "You moved the lamp," she said finally, as if acknowledging a bargain. "It learned that." She rose then, fluid as a practiced bow, and paused with her hand on the handle. "You should change your clock," she added, almost conversational. "It keeps showing it your favorite minute." I looked before I could stop myself. The brass hand kissed 17 again, neat, exact, as if the room had rehearsed the moment for us both. Claire opened the door, and the corridor's brighter light washed our edges clean without making either of us warmer. That evening, the day folded itself into a thin, resistant shape, the kind of origami that remembers the hands that made it. I stayed at the office later than usual, rearranging files that required no rearranging and pretending the angle of the lamp could solve a problem of air and seam. When I finally locked the door, the hallway smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, and the elevator hesitated before agreeing to open. Outside, the city had flattened into wet reflections. I walked home with my hands deep in my coat, counting intersections like beads, and found myself pausing at every corner as if something might be waiting just off the angle of the building. In the apartment, I left the lights on deliberately, as if brightness were a contract I could enforce. The kettle rattled, the radiator tapped its patient code. I opened my notes to the line I shouldn't have written, "Room altered," and underlined it. Not twice, just once. The way you mark a door you might need to find again in the dark. My phone vibrated across the table, the screen bright with a hospital number. "Keller," the voice said, efficient, tired. I could hear the busy hush of a ward behind her, carts, shoes, air. I introduced myself, summarized Claire in 10 sentences that felt small against the shape they described. There was a pause, like a held breath. "Mornings were better," she said at last. "We scheduled at 9. She tolerated the first 20 minutes, then the room would change." She didn't embellish. Staff noted unusual fixations on corners and reflective surfaces. When lights flickered, symptoms intensified. Another pause. "Does your office have a window behind you?" I looked at the glass, at my own double shadow in it. "Yes," I said. "Bring the lamp closer," she said softly. "And don't humor the minute." Before I could ask what she meant, a page pulled her away. The line went dead with a small, respectful click. I carried the lamp across the room, its cord unfurling like a slow fuse, and set it on the bookshelf that always felt a fraction too far from me. The shadows obeyed, retreating into neat, disciplined triangles. The gesture made me feel foolish and steadied, both at once. I left the lamp there and wrote for an hour. Treatment scaffolds, neurological differentials, appointments to arrange. When I looked up, The apartment was a stage set, furniture arranged to imply safety, light thick on the surfaces, darkness gathered into the margins with the patience of a collector. I washed my cup, turned the lock, checked it twice. In the bedroom, the clock on the dresser wore its brass face like a polite smile. I nudged the minute hand forward one notch. It returned to its proper place with the virtue of a soldier. I lay down anyway, telling my body a story about sleep. It worked for a while. Then the air thinned, not colder, just farther away, and the small sounds of the room, radiator, pipes, blurred into something damp, patient, practiced. I opened my eyes to a light that felt crowded. The seam where the dresser meets the wall looked wider, an invitation I had not issued. The clock said 3:16. I watched, willing it to move past the number that had begun to feel like a made thing. It did, with ceremony, and arrived at 3:17, as if relieved to be seen. I told myself to get up, to cross the room and adjust the lamp, but the idea of leaving the narrow boat of the bed felt treacherous, a step into water that had memorized my weight. In the corner, the shadow held its line, exact, and yet I could not shake the sense of something learning to stand inside it, as if the darkness had found a skeleton and was testing how it fitted. I slept after that, or I passed into something that imitated sleep closely enough to trick my pulse. When the morning finally arrived, the room had the brittle cheer of a place that has been forgiven for what it did at night. I rose carefully, as if the floor might shift, and moved the lamp another inch toward the seam. The filaments warmed, gold as a small vow. I said nothing out loud. The clock resumed its weekday authority. Still, when I left for the office, I locked the door and stood on the landing a moment longer than necessary, listening for the soft, wet sound of breath where no one stood. Claire arrived with a thin sketchbook pressed flat against her chest, the kind of student pad whose cardboard back remembers every hand that's held it. She placed it on the table as if returning something borrowed, then folded her hands and waited. The room had already arranged itself in response. Lamp closer, shadows obedient. The seam behind me narrowed to a polite suggestion. I asked about sleep. She said, "It rehearsed." I asked what that meant. She nodded at the sketchbook. "It prefers when I draw." I slid the pad toward me. The cover was cold, smelling faintly of graphite and damp paper. Inside, the first page showed a room with a window and a brass clock and a shelf too far from the chair. My office, exact down to the small crack in the ceiling that migrates with the seasons. The perspective was wrong in a way that made me swallow, drawn from behind my seat, as if the artist had stood where the wall refuses light. In the corner, a blurred figure rose like smoke that has chosen a spine. No face, only the stubborn suggestion of two dark ovals that refused to be eyes. "How did you choose the angle?" I asked, keeping my own voice unremarkable. Claire looked at the seam past my shoulder and then back at me. "I didn't choose," she said. "It prefers to be seen from where it stands." She turned a page, another drawing of the office, this time closer. The back of my chair, the edge of my hair, the lamp's circle cutting the dark into a clean wound. On the clock, the hands rested at 3:17. I felt the muscles along my neck arrange themselves into a question and refused to turn. We worked through the pages slowly. Her apartment appeared in pale, careful lines. The window too wide. The corners pulled a fraction inward, like lips narrowing around a straw. A hallway with a light that had failed and never been replaced. A stairwell where the angles had learned a new language. In every image, the shadow stood at an edge, as if auditioning for the role of structure. "Do you draw while it's there?" I asked. Claire's mouth made almost a smile. "It stands better when I do." On the 7th page, she had sketched the surface of my desk with an accuracy that felt impolite. The faint heat ring from my mug, the shallow nick where a pen had bitten wood, the way the legal pad sits a degree off square when I'm tired. Behind the desk, my reflection ghosted in the window as a smudge. Over my shoulder, the dark. It wasn't theatrical. It looked patient, the kind of patience that learns a room's habits and then practices them. The radiator exhaled. The clock ticked with its faithful brass certainty, and then, for one beat, seemed to hesitate. I watched the second hand remember itself. Claire's eyes did not leave mine. "It wants you to look," she said almost kindly. "It thinks looking is a kind of invitation." I kept my gaze where it was meant to be and asked about headaches, any aura, any taste of metal. She shook her head. Only the cloth, she said. Only the breath through cloth. When I asked if the drawings helped, she said, they make the room honest. I felt the lamp's heat on my cheek and the coolness gather between my shoulder blades, the border where light fails and the body learns about borders. I closed the sketchbook gently and placed it back in the center of the desk. The cardboard made a soft sound, like a book agreeing to be shut. May I keep it for a day? I asked. Claire considered, then tilted her head as if listening to the hallway for instruction. One night, she said. It prefers to see what you write. At the end of the hour, I walked her to the door because ritual steadies rooms. She paused with her hand on the handle and spoke to the space behind me rather than to me. It knows your minute, she said, but it can learn others. The corridor light came up with its usual delay. She left. I returned to the desk and opened the sketchbook to the first page again. In the drawn window, my reflection watched me watch it. A charcoal smudge with no face. The clock in the picture showed 3:17. The clock beside me agreed. The room held still, as if waiting to see which reality would be polite enough to move first. I returned the sketchbook to the office before sunrise, the building still hollow with night, the corridor lights waking in sections like an animal opening one eye at a time. I moved the lamp another inch toward the bookcase and set the clock forward 2 minutes, a petty defiance that made the room feel briefly mine. At 8:30, Dr. Henry Collins arrived, wool coat damp at the shoulders, the cold still braided into his breath. He has the kind of face that makes juries listen. I told him what I could without telling him what the air does when Claire looks at me. He listened, thumbs pressed to his pen as if measuring the pressure required to write a verdict. We agreed he would sit in, only for observation, if she consented. I dislike observers. Therapy is a narrow bridge and extra footsteps make it sway. But I wanted another witness to the way minutes have learned me. When Claire entered, she glanced at Henry and then at the seam behind me. It prefers an audience, she said, with a calm that mocked the word prefer. I explained his role. She nodded. The clock gave a small, approving tick, like a throat clearing. We began as if beginning mattered. Sleep, headaches, food. She answered in fragments, saving something for the edges. Henry's pen scratched and then stalled, not for want of ink. His wrist had stopped. He frowned, tapped the face of his watch, and smiled the way a man smiles at a superstition he hasn't chosen yet. We'll keep our attention ordinary, I said. Ordinary is powerful. Claire tilted her head. It learns ordinary fastest. I angled the lamp so the circle grazed the shelf and bruised the seam into retreat. The light made a neat wound in the shadow. Claire's gaze fell on the cut edge and stayed there, as if reading a line written in black. Where is it now? I asked. Standing, she said. Trying your colleague's measure. Henry shifted, a professional movement, and the radiator released a sigh that sounded like cloth lifting from wet tile. He glanced at the vent. I did not. We touched the sketchbook without opening it, as if the cardboard housed a modest animal. I asked her to describe without drawing. She spoke of corners that fold closer when the room blanks out, of a breath that rehearses patience until patience becomes the room. Her language remained clean, unadorned, never reaching for drama, which made it worse. When she paused, the silence did not. It behaved like a person who has been told they may speak and chooses not to. At 9:16, the brass clock cleared its throat again. I felt the second hand gather like a runner at the block. Claire's eyes brightened. Not joy, but readiness. Don't look, she said. But I was already looking, because knowing the rule is not protection against the habit. The hand approached 17 and waited, the way a door waits to finish closing when a finger holds it softly back. My breath ran out, and then continued without me. Henry checked his watch and hissed a laugh he didn't intend. Stuck, he whispered, and the whisper made the room step closer. Then time behaved itself, as if embarrassed, and resumed. The second hand crossed into the new minute, and something in the air loosened as though a fist had let go without admitting it had tightened. Claire's shoulders fell a fraction. It practices, she said. It's better every day. Henry wrote this down with care, each letter separated as if spacing might save him. After she left, he stayed seated, eyes on the seam where the light failed. You know the risks, he said. Counter-transference. Folie à deux if you feed it badly enough. But the room... He let the word hang. Move the shelf, kill the corners, bring in a second lamp and... He tapped the brass face with a knuckle. Don't let it teach you a number. I nodded, as if refusal were a skill. He put on his coat, paused at the door, and then adjusted his watch forward 2 minutes, a man rescuing himself from a tide that had not yet been named. I arrived before the building remembered it was day. 2 lamps now, one on the desk, one shouldered up against the bookcase, through overlapping circles that left the seam behind me thinned to a crease. I had shifted the shelf 3 inches to blunt the corner and taped a pale stripe along the baseboard, a childish tactic that made the room feel briefly manual, as if I could edit geometry with office supplies. The brass clock had been demoted to the far end of the bookcase. I told myself distance was a cure. The radiator answered with a slow, contented breath, like cloth being lifted from tile. Claire came at 9 on the dot, the kind of exactness that feels less like punctuality than prophecy. She paused in the doorway, as if taking attendance, and then sat. Her gaze did not bother with me. It chose the seam, measured the lamp's new authority, and settled. I asked about the week. It practiced, she said. Corners learned to lean without moving. I felt the tape along the baseboard become an insult. We began the ritual of anchoring. 5 things seen, 4 touched. She named both lamps, the hairline fissure that migrates with seasons, the shadow of the window frame on the far wall. When asked to touch, she reached for the arm of the chair and then stopped, fingers hovering as if expecting the fabric to react. 3 sounds, I prompted. Your breath, she said. The vent. She tilted her head, listening to a place in the room that did not admit to being a place. And the wet. I turned the desk lamp a fraction. The circle slid, clean as a blade, and the seam tucked itself smaller. The overhead fluorescence flickered once, then steadied, as if embarrassed to be caught blinking. Claire's mouth found a shape it had not shown me before, the beginning of a smile, practiced on other rooms. It likes that, she said. It learns faster under pressure. I checked my phone, 9:14, and avoided the brass face exiled to the shelf. The air thickened, not colder, just layered, like a curtain had been drawn through it and left behind a second version of the room. My pen grew heavy. The legal pad's faint blue lines deepened into a subtle river. The second lamp made a small sound, filament adjusting, and the shadow behind me changed quality. Not darker, exactly, but more convinced of itself. Claire blinked slowly. Don't stand, she said. It prefers height changes. The fluorescence dimmed, as if a cloud had passed across an indoor sky. In the window, my reflection separated from me by a breath and then reconciled, the way a person steps aside to let someone through and then realizes the hallway is a mirror. The wet sound arrived, soft, delicate, the exact cadence of someone breathing through cloth with patient intent. I wanted to count, to give the room ordinary numbers, but the urge felt borrowed. I looked anyway. The brass clock across the room showed 3:17 with the quiet confidence of a fact. My phone held steady at 9:16. The second hand on the clock did not move. The feeling that followed was not fear, but the precise humiliation of realizing I had trained a thing that did not belong to me. Claire's smile reached completion, small and ruinous. There, she said. It can hold you now. I moved the lamp toward the seam until the cord went tight. The circle widened, spilling gold into the crease like balm. The fluorescence steadied. The wet sound retreated with the courtesy of a guest excusing itself before dessert. The brass hand on the clock shuddered and resumed its sweep, suddenly industrious. Claire's smile folded away. It will come better, she said. It learns what you rescue. She stood without prompting. I opened the door. In the brighter hall, the building was daytime again. But when I stepped back into the office alone, the strip of tape along the baseboard had peeled itself at one corner and curled upward like a small, listening ear. Claire did not come at 9. The chair opposite me was a prepared absence, the lamp's twin circles holding their border like a stitched wound. At 9:07, the elevator sighed and stuttered. Footsteps paused at my door and moved on. I called her number and reached a silence that did not bother to pretend it was a voicemail. I told myself to do ordinary things, review labs, send a note, drink water, and did them with the precision of someone diffusing a toy bomb. At 9:23, the handle turned. Claire entered without apology, damp at the hairline, as if she'd walked through a mist that only wanted her. She did not sit at first. She stood exactly where the seam thinned and watched the circle of light press against her skirt. "It wanted to see if you'd wait," she said, then lowered herself into the chair like a diver folding into water. I sat. We did not reach for pleasantries. "It practiced last night," she added. "It found new minutes." I kept my phone face up beside the legal pad like a talisman. "Which minutes?" I asked. Claire blinked, the long blink that rearranges a room. "The ones you look at when you're afraid you've lost time," she said. The brass clock on the shelf pretended not to hear. I suggested we anchor. 5 things seen. She named both lamps, the peeled corner of tape, the hairline crack that had migrated, the reflection of the window frame on my glasses. 4 things touched. Her fingers pressed the chair's arm. Mine felt too loud against the paper. 3 sounds. "Your breath," she said. "The vent." A pause. "And the cloth." The fluorescence dimmed, then steadied. The room acquired density, like water again, the kind that makes you heavy and careful. "Where is it now?" I asked. Claire did not look away from me. "Behind you," she said, "learning how you sit when you're the one observed." I felt the knowledge like a coin placed on my tongue. The brass clock cleared its tiny throat. My phone read 9:31. The clock's minute hand, with ceremonial certainty, pointed to 17. The second hand paused in its small pilgrimage. "Don't look," she said. Not a command, an etiquette. I failed it. The clock's stillness hummed, a held note. The air thinned. The wet sound came closer, affectionate, patient. I angled the desk lamp until the circle grazed the shelf and bled gold into the seam. The shadow adjusted, undisturbed. Claire watched me with the terrible kindness of someone refusing to name a diagnosis. "It wasn't after me," she said. "It liked that I knew how to stand for it, but it came for the way you refused to leave a light off." The second hand resumed with a hitch, a courtesy. The minute hand did not move. The phone screen slept and woke and gave me the same numbers, polite and useless. I spoke. Medication scaffolds, sleep study, safety planning. Sentences laid like planks over water. Claire nodded, and for a heartbeat I saw how easy it would be to call this Foley, to tuck the wet sound into our shared professional cupboard. "We should end," she said softly. "It likes when you try to rescue the hour." I stood to walk her to the door. The fluorescence brightened as if the building had remembered how day works. In the hall, she looked past me, not at the seam, but at my reflection in the sidelight, the two of me failing to line up. "Don't write in the dark," she said. "It reads over your shoulder." She left, like a sentence ending where it meant to. Back at the desk, the sketchbook sat where she had not placed it. I opened it because refusal is its own invitation. A new page waited. My street, my building, the second-floor window, with the faint mismatch where the sash was repaired last winter. The lamp on my dresser was drawn as a pale coin. On the sidewalk, a long, careful smear stood with its face angled up, 2 dark ovals not admitting to being eyes. I closed the book. I called the number again. Nothing. I checked the door, the corners, the peeling tape. The brass hand, courteous at last, rolled past 17 and did not look back. Claire missed the next morning without calling. I told myself to let absence be a data point and not an omen. I left 2 messages anyway, one formal, one softer, and phoned the ER to ask for a welfare check I couched in clinical language. "Doctor," Keller replied with a single line. "She's not on our boards." The office behaved like day, obedient and ordinary, and still the brass clock on the shelf found its ceremony. 3:17, with the steady confidence of an address. I moved it to a drawer, closed the drawer, and heard the faintest click as if a hand inside had agreed to the arrangement. At dusk, the corridor smelled of bleach and old carpet. I carried the sketchbook home because I didn't trust leaving it where the room could read. Outside, Commonwealth Avenue watched itself in wet pavement. My apartment received me with its usual inventory, radiator, kettle, the allegiance of lamplight. I set the sketchbook on the table, turned both lamps on, and stood long enough to discover there are silences I recognize now, the one that comes before a minute rehearses itself, and the other, damp and patient, that lifts like breath through cloth. I opened to the last drawing, the street, my building, the second-floor window that never quite aligns. The next page, which I hadn't seen, showed my kitchen at night. Chair, table, a glass with a ring of water around its base. A shadow stood in the seam where the cabinet meets the wall. No face, only those 2 refusing ovals. The page after that caught my hallway from waist height, as though drawn by someone seated on the floor. The lamp at the far end burned like a coin. My stomach learned how to curl without moving. I told myself to make tea. I told myself not to look at the clock. The kettle clicked and cooled. The apartment's corners pulled themselves a fraction closer the way a mouth narrows before a word. I felt the minute arrive, light thinning without dimming, air stretched, not colder, just farther. My phone read 11:16. The dresser clock, which I had set wrong on purpose, corrected me with neat, indifferent hands. 3:17. I didn't walk to it. I looked at the window instead and let the glass do the turning for me. In the reflection, the room collected itself around a seam that didn't exist in the daytime. Something stood in it, the exact patience of the drawings, a posture learned from practice. The wet sound grew affectionate, as if pleased I'd chosen the polite way to look. My throat remembered the weight of a hand that was not there. "Claire," I said, though I did not believe in names at that distance. The shadow didn't widen or step, it only inclined, the bare respect of acknowledgement. The lamp nearest the window flickered, then steadied, faithful to the small vow I'd made to keep it lit. The reflection held. The ovals did not blink. I understood, with the clarity that arrives as a punishment, that it had never been outside my window in the drawings. It had been standing where the light won't go, waiting for my gaze to find the angle that would teach me its shape. I did not turn. I wrote one sentence in my notes. No diagnosis, no plan, just the hour and the act of being watched. When I looked back up, the reflection had eased closer by the width of my breath, and in it, finally, I saw eyes. Not light on glass, not a trick of corners, a gaze, level with mine, patient as practice, dark enough to learn me by heart.